Well, Graham, thank you very much for these nice words of introduction. And I see the hall started to empty when Jim Mather left. I do promise you, I'm not going to give you a self-congratulatory election broadcast. So you're safe from that. I think that the role of the CBI is fairly well known. We're funded entirely by our members, and they're located throughout Scotland. They span all sectors of the economy and are of all sizes, from FTSE 100 firms to SMEs and trade associations. We're first and foremost a business advocacy organisation, highlighting to government and other policy makers, the media and the wider public, our members' public policy priorities and solutions in order to improve the effectiveness and success of the UK's economy and competitiveness. And of course, when I say the UK, I mean Scotland, and much of what I say to you today will be in that context. Now, it's an important period for Scotland's economy and the public policy landscape. And as you know, businesses haven't had the challenges to seek over the past few years, and they will certainly be looking for respite and inspiration from the Chancellor's budget next week when he stands up and makes a statement to Parliament. Businesses will also be looking for inspiration from the political parties here as they publish their manifestos for the elections to the Scottish Parliament in May. Now, it is true that looking for inspiration may be a tall order at the moment, given the short-termism that too often bedevils current political thinking north of the border on important matters such as public sector reform and undergraduate contributions to fund our universities. That said, as a country, we are making history. And we're making history because outside of war, we have never had a national deficit and government debt as large as it is now. And we're making history because never before has a government or group of public officials sought to reduce the deficit as quickly as is currently planned. And Jim Mather referred to this a moment ago in his own address. Now, if we're going to be able to meet these challenges, then no doubt our children and in time grandchildren will not remember us for it. But if we fail to meet the challenge, and I'm afraid that they will remember, not least as other significant financial headaches loom large for a nation, on government provided pensions and health care, to name but two. Now, let me say something about this deficit. Jim Mather said we were cutting too far, too fast. In this year, the UK government will borrow £149 billion. And it will go on borrowing hefty sums and adding to the national debt for several years to come. And the UK hasn't had a financial surplus since the start of the last decade. And as you all know, the annual deficit doesn't just disappear at the end of the fiscal year, it is added to previous year's deficits. And the annual interest payments on the national debt are forecast to swell from £43 billion this year to £63 billion over the next 5 years alone. So the gap between the state's spending and its revenues must be closed. And fast. Now, I agree with Jim Mather on many things. On this issue, I don't. About 50 billion of the deficit will disappear. It will go as economic recovery increases the tax yield and the costs associated with recession come down. But the remaining annual deficit of nearly £100 billion a year is structural. It will not just melt away. And that is the extent to which the cost of the UK's public services exceed our ability to pay for it on a sustainable basis year after year. So it will be painful, but the high level of government debt undoubtedly has to be tackled, or it will shackle and hold back our economy for many years to come. And I'm confident that it can be overcome, but it needs to be tackled. The government has traditionally turned to taxation as one route to restore its finances. Indeed, VAT VAT has already risen, and national insurance contributions are set to rise next month. And other measures are on the way too to cut the cost of the welfare bill. However, the CBI has supported the broad thrust that spending constraint rather than tax rises should be the main focus. We believe it makes sense, as higher taxes stunt growth and incentives and leave firms with less money to invest and expand. And we can't afford to lose any more ground in terms of the UK's international tax competitiveness. So the Chancellor of the Exchequer has a great opportunity next week to build on his promise to make Britain's corporate tax system the most competitive in the G20. Retained profits are likely to play a larger role in funding firms' future investment plans, given the constraints of traditional lending sources, so the strategy to reduce the headline and smaller firms' rates of corporation tax is particularly welcome. But the CBI believes that the Chancellor needs to go further on tax and in other areas. That's why in our budget submission and our meetings with him last week, we stressed three priorities: boosting exports, improving the environment for business to invest, and lifting the constraints on high-growth companies. Now, this kind of focus will assist the transition towards rebalancing our economy away from an over-reliance on debt-fueled consumer and government spending and financial services. And we have set out a number of proposals designed to make export finance more accessible for small firms, encourage a wider range of finance for firms rather than relying on bank lending alone, and reforming unfair dismissal and employment tribunals to promote job creation. And we also want to see a pathway which will lead to the reduction in the 50p rate of income tax. We believe it's a barrier to retaining talent on these shores, let alone attracting overseas talent, and it does send out the wrong message across the globe. Chancellor should also ensure a stable and supportive North Sea fiscal regime to encourage the maximum cost-effective exploration of the UK's indigenous oil and gas reserves. And the future success of the offshore industry, as well as our indigenous whisky producers, must be nurtured and not taken for granted. So there's a role for the Chancellor there in the budget. Budget notwithstanding, however, there are other issues that CBI Scotland would like the UK government to get a grip on, which threaten to undermine Scottish businesses. For example, the blocking of extra runway capacity at Heathrow and Gatwick airports has already raised questions about the UK's government strategy for helping Scots firms export and expand abroad, and for encouraging overseas tourists and investors to come north here while switching flights at Heathrow and Gatwick. So the government should avoid doing anything that makes it more difficult and expensive for companies to access overseas markets or service their foreign-based customers. There is also the threat of relocalisation of the business rate south of the border. That's a concern because if that were to happen, it could open the door to such a policy in Scotland and unwind one of the Scottish business's biggest gains over recent years. That's the uniform business rate and rate poundage parity with England, which is very important to our members. Now, it is true that the big macroeconomic decisions for the UK are taken at Westminster, but the policies of the Scottish Government and Parliament are of critical importance too, and we'll see some further changes to the default settlement after the Scotland Bill becomes law later this year. But the devolved institutions have a substantial budget, in excess of £30 billion each year. They also have responsibility for many areas of public policy important to business and control most of the microeconomic powers needed to improve productivity and the supply side of our economy. And to think of a few, there's business and export support, public procurement, which you're all interested in here, education, lifelong learning, skills, transport, planning, renewable energy, funding infrastructure, investment. Now, in education, let me say something about that, and I want to say something about the future of higher education and its funding. 2.5 months ago, in my New Year message, I called on Scotland's politicians this election year to give strong leadership and not be tempted to avoid tough but necessary decisions in order to quote popularity. And I hope that my members are not going to be disappointed. 2 weeks ago, the Scottish Cabinet Secretary for Education convened a summit of interested parties to discuss the findings of a joint Scottish Government and universities expert group on university income. And later, the Cabinet Secretary claimed that the Scottish analyses, the Scottish Government's analyses, suggested that a net funding gap of around £93 million a year could emerge with the rest of the UK in 2014-2015. And this was followed by the Scottish Parliamentary Labour and SNP leaders making public commitments that their parties would not introduce a graduate contribution on the basis that this funding gap could be bridged. Now, I understand that. I understand all that, and I understand the temptations to do it. But there is a danger in relying on this figure. The paper presented by the Cabinet Secretary was a useful piece of work, and it was a very good piece of work as well. But the £93 million figure is at the lower end of the range of estimates, and it is a very controversial figure. Other estimates in the Scottish Government's paper suggest that the gap might be around £200 million or more. Moreover, the paper only benchmarks Scottish higher education funding against a range of funding positions for England. Our universities are international institutions, and they need to compete with the best universities in the world to attract talent and students, and also to continue to offer the best in teaching and research. So how Scotland's HE funding compares globally is the real test that should be applied. Scottish Government's paper on HE funding should, in my view, be regarded as work in progress only, and our politicians should avoid making rash promises that they may not be able to fulfil without signing a blank cheque or underfunding universities or other important areas of the Scottish economy going into the future. If as a country we are going to put Scotland's HE funding on a competitive and sustainable basis for the future, more work needs to be done, and our politicians must be prepared to take hard decisions in the overall long-term interests of Scotland on that particular issue.